Howdy again everyone, my name's Chris and today I have a brand new lens from Chinese manufacturer Viltrox for you all, their AF 24mm f1.8 FE. A couple of things will grab your attention just from its name. Firstly, it's an autofocus lens with a bright aperture, always important, and secondly, it's for Sony's full-frame mirrorless cameras. There are surprisingly few autofocus 24mm lens options available on that really quite old system at the moment, let alone one at a relatively low price point of $425. Hopefully, it should be reasonably capable, as 24mm is a really enjoyable focal length to work with for all kinds of users, being wide enough on a full-frame camera to add a touch of drama to your images and really get in the whole picture. I'd like to thank Viltrox for sending me a copy of this lens for testing, although as usual, this is a totally independent review. First off, the build quality, and anyone who's handled a Viltrox lens before will be very familiar with how it feels and works. The lens barrel is solid and metallic, feeling pretty tough with a nice brushed finish to it. The lens mount is also made of metal, as you can see, and although there's no weather sealing gasket here, there is a USB-C port for future firmware updates, and Viltrox have a good reputation for keeping their lenses updated nicely. Next, there comes a metallic aperture ring, which turns around without clicks, except to get into auto mode. It turns with just enough resistance to stop you accidentally changing aperture. I'd prefer a mechanism with clicks myself, although the smooth aperture change looks very nice when shooting video, which is important for some users. The autofocus motor works silently, and at an average speed, it will probably work a bit faster on a newer camera body than this one. When shooting in stills mode, you hear a very quiet click when it finally reaches the focus point, but I couldn't get that to happen when shooting video. Another good point for video makers is that the lens doesn't really display much focus breathing, as you can see here. The lens's filter size is a fairly small 55mm, and it comes with a little plastic hood. The lens does not have image stabilization. Overall, in terms of build quality, it's an awesome little package, nice and small and tough, works perfectly well, and it could be especially useful for video work. Now, let's take a look at image quality. I'll start by testing it on a full-frame camera, my 42MP Sony a7R II. In the middle of the image, straight from f1.8, we see excellent sharpness and contrast, although with just a tiny bit of visible purple fringing. Let's take a look in the corners. They are definitely softer and very dark, but we are still seeing some detail being captured and not too much in the way of colour fringing. Let's drop down to f2.8. There's quite an improvement there. Sharpness isn't perfect, and nor is it perfectly even, but we are seeing much more detail now. Back in the middle, we see a little more contrast than before, and no more purple fringing, leaving us with perfect image quality there. Here's f4 in the middle, and back in the corners, where we only see a marginal improvement now. f5.6 looks impressively sharper though, with excellent resolution across the entire image frame. It stays this sharp down to f11, although as you'd expect, stop down to f16 for a slight softening due to the effect of diffraction. Overall, it's somewhat better image quality than you might expect from a low-budget, full-frame lens with such a bright aperture. Things are a bit murky and somewhat soft in the corners at the brightest apertures, but there's always some good detail being captured, and excellent detail when the lens is topped down a bit. Alright, let's test it on an APS-C camera now, my little Sony a5100 with its 24MP sensor. At f1.8, the lens is nice and sharp in the middle with lots of contrast, although a touch of purple fringing is visible here. The corner image quality is soft. f2.8 looks about the same in the corners, but back in the middle, any trace of colour fringing is gone, leaving absolutely perfect image quality. f4 looks just as sharp in the middle, as you'd expect, and the corners look a bit clearer now. At f5.6 the corners are fairly sharp, and at f8 they look sharper again. If you stop down as far as f16, you'll see softness emerging due to the effects of diffraction. So it's not an ideal performance on an APS-C camera. The image quality in the middle is dazzlingly sharp, but the corners need a lot of stopping down before good quality emerges there. Now let's move on and look at distortion and vignetting on a full frame camera. These pictures are taken with the in-camera corrections turned off. As you might have guessed from the sharpness section, the Viltrox lens runs into some serious problems here. Right away you can see one of the waviest distortion patterns I've ever encountered, accompanied by very dark vignetting in the corners at f1.8. Stop down to f2.8 or f5.6 to see that vignetting lighten up a little, but even stop down it's still quite noticeable. The only good news here is that Viltrox are publishing a lens correction profile on their website, which you will definitely want to download to correct your images with in editing. Let's take a look at close-up image quality now. The lens can focus down to about 30 centimeters, so not especially close to your subject. The good news though is that close-up image quality remains pretty sharp even at f1.8, and if you stop down to f2.8 it becomes really optimal again. Now let's see how the lens works against bright lights. It's a big black mark here, I'm afraid. We witness quite major flaring and glaring even when the bright light in question is not in your picture, and the lens's somewhat small sized hood will only be of limited benefit to prevent it. While we're working in the dark, let's take a look at coma levels. At f1.8, bright lights in the corner of your images show some pretty huge smearing here. I've seen worse than this before, but not by much. At f2.8 the situation has improved, but it's only really when stopped down to f5.6 that the coma is sufficiently gone. Let's zoom out a bit and look for some sun stars. They are just barely visible at f5.6, as you can see here, but if you stop all the way down to f8, then they become pretty impressive if the light is bright enough. Finally, let's take a look at this lens's bokeh. 24mm is a pretty wide angle, but at f1.8 you can still separate your background quite noticeably. Generally, the lens comports itself well when it comes to the quality of those backgrounds. They look fairly soft to me in most situations. Very bright points of light show a little green highlighting though, which can lead to some busyness in very particular situations, but that's a fairly rare occurrence. Overall, although it's quite exciting to have a bright aperture, low budget 24mm lens available for Sony's full frame cameras, it is blighted by pretty mixed image quality. It's blessed with reasonably sharp optics and nice quality bokeh, while being let down by some pretty extreme vignetting and distortion, not to mention high coma levels and a lot of flaring. Its build quality is certainly very nice though, and it might be pretty useful for video work. I'd say that, given its strengths and weaknesses, $400 is just about a fair price for it, for any 24mm lens enthusiasts who are on a budget.